Good afternoon, everyone. I do hope all of you weathered the storm that was pummeling your area last Thursday night. And again, I got so many calls about closings. I don't know how a seller who's required to keep all the utilities on and then the utilities go because of the weather and the storm, where a buyer would ever accept the property without making sure it doesn't have damage. If it's being financed, I can guarantee you there's no lender that will fund until they are assured that there is no damage. And a lot of that takes time to get those, those guys, there are only so many of them, to get them back out there and appraise and make sure that the value is still there, that there's no damage on anything like that. Our contract accounts for that if there's damage, but just as Karen was talking about, there was extremely high wind and roofs. You know how homeowners insurance is right now. They don't cover replacement cost on certain roofs of a certain age. It's just what it's worth, the cash value, and that causes a lot of problems typically in our insurance world for the homeowners. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about, I'm going to ask you questions, and then you're going to take yourself off of mute and answer. Would you ever do these things, or would you never do these things, and why? Oh, I love your puppy. And so sign them up. Get a license number. We're going to town here. But first I want to talk about the deadlines that we're facing. August 17th, right? This is the big deadline that the MLSs will comply with the NAR settlement, stating that there will be no offer of compensation at all in MLS. There's lots of issues about that, but the biggest thing is that for buyers agents, right? They're saying that you have to have a signed buyer tenant agreement. Texas Realtors is great. They're looking at the forms right now, and they're fine tuning them in light of the settlement agreement. But nobody gets to show a property August 17th without having that signed buyer tenant agreement in place. The problem will be is if your buyer is financing, right? Those are the elements that are going to cause another process. Our best business practices were always to have a signed buyer tenant agreement. So we're fine on that. We're used to doing that. The problem is some agents might not do it in the requirement. I don't know who's going to monitor that. That is a requirement. I don't know what's going to happen on that. All I know is that if you're not doing it, just be sure that you could be involved in a class action lawsuit. These class action lawsuits are not going to go away, folks. You know that once this settlement agreement and MLSs are changed, that there is going to be a group of attorneys that are going to want to take it on and say, did you get that signed buyer tenant agreement before they showed you a property? So you all better be funding your reserves right now, because you're going to need them if you don't follow the right way that we're going about them. The thing that I told you about last time, and I want to reiterate, the broker law committee was really behind the 8 ball, in my opinion. When they all met in April, they were all acting like a deer with headlights in their eyes. Some of the lawyers on the committee felt like that's not their job to get you compensation. Okay. And so we even had, as I mentioned, one of Lee York, who is on the TREC, she's a TREC commissioner. She was highly offended by their comments on that. Texas Realtors, our dear Lori Levy, who leads a wonderful organization and has lots of great attorneys that are advise the broker lawyer committee, look, you either need to do something like you currently have in the farm and ranch contract, or maybe something like we have at Texas Realtors that we've done for commercial contracts. But bottom line is they're not meeting until July. They're not going to do anything, because they're asking you right now to give your recommendation. What would you like to see? So all of you need to get in there. They look at every response. They're forced to read them. and then comment on them even in their broker Leroy committee meeting. So again, get in there and voice your opinion. I'm going to tell you, they're so far behind the 8 ball, it just makes me concerned. The only reason they created this committee to look at this, and the only reason they're considering it is because the TREC commissioner, he piped up and said, you know, really, this is a consumer protection issue. So TREC would be able to do something if it was consumer, because they're a consumer protection agency. The legislature doesn't give them any authority over compensation, right? They just make certain statements in some of our forms, our TREC forms. So again, I'm very concerned about there not being proactive in this respect. They were really hesitant. So please get on there and give your opinion about what you'd like to see. For those of you who don't practice farm and ranch, it's an actual provision in the at the end of the contract that says the buyers and sellers will sign it, attesting to the compensation, the amount, and who's paying. So as it stands right now, we don't have any changes reflecting those types of abilities in our 1 to 4 family contracts. So what it's going to take is you're revising your best business practices. You're going to have to do a whole lot of things up front before you ever show somebody property. And so we'll talk about that a little bit next month. But again, this deadline is August 17th. And please go out to TREC. It's on their first page when it comes up, and go to the broker Leroy committee and click on that and give your opinions. As I said, they read each one of them and respond to them when they meet. So let them know what it is. I personally, in my world, there would be a way for a buyer agent who's under a buyer tenant agreement to be able to put an offer with that buyer on the property and have a provision either at the end of the contract, the ratification of broker's fees, or a special addendum, so that the buyer could present an offer and it would be clear what the buyer was requesting, who would pay the compensation and the amount. To me, otherwise, you know how hard it is to get a listing agent to respond to you in a timely fashion. Sometimes, you know, they're busy just like you are. So while you want to get this done, you can't rely upon a text from a listing agent saying, yeah, we'll pay you. Oh, no. We have registration agreements, and they can only be in writing in those forms that we have. We would never take a text as being assured that you're going to receive it. And I don't know about you, but that's an important factor, because it is tied to if we're going to represent a party or not on something like that. Any questions in general? Okie dokie. So what we're going to do is we are going to, would you ever do this or never do this? Okay, so you're going to have to take yourself off of mute and answer these questions. Okay. Would you ever conduct a commercial transaction without your broker's written permission?
No.
Great.
No.
Would you ever represent a seller in a short sale situation or other legal impediment to selling the property without the broker's written approval for you to conduct the transaction?
I wouldn't.
I wouldn't either.
Good for you. Would you ever act like a property manager for an owner without permission in writing from the broker to be a property manager?
No.
No, absolutely not.
No. Property management is so risk laden, and it's filled with everything. As I said, over the past decade, TREC has really balanced. Are we going to have a special license for property managers? That's how critical that specialty is. Would you ever conduct a transaction outside of the geographic area your broker has given you permission to conduct?
No.
No, you would not do that. So you would never do all of that. So that's a good thing. So now we're going to get to advertising.
Marilyn, I have a question on that though.
Uh-huh.
If you got permission from your broker, which I thought it was okay, but with the caveat that you don't know the area. So can you say if you know the area, if you're familiar with it, is it okay?
Yeah, well, that's what your broker is supposed to do, evaluate your proficiency. So if they have to evaluate proficiency before they'll ever give you written permission.
So, but then it's okay then.
Well, it'll be on the broker if they gave you permission to do something where you were not proficient in the geographic area.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Trek has lots of rules that the broker is required to be a part of. Okay, advertising. Would you ever use any photos, floor plans, sketches, renditions, and surveys unless you have a written agreement from the owner of these materials in your advertising, listing agreement, contract, or any other marketing materials?
I would say no, but I run into difficulty on these surveys.
Well, I don't have any difficulty. The buyer's always going to get their new one.
That's what I tell them, but then this listing agent shows a survey and to the title company, and the title company tells us in
Yeah, well,
writing
they
that
shouldn't
have
be
a
butting
survey.
into the contract between a buyer and a seller. That's very
It
clear.
should be, right.
And I have a title company that said, oh, well, we'll just notarize the T-47 at closing. Well, great. Are you going to pay for the new survey? Because the 6C1 is very clear and bold if the seller fails to provide both. Now,
Right.
one of the changes that they're going before the Texas Department of Insurance, and I told you about this several months ago, is they're creating a declaration. A declaration by the seller will not be required to be notarized. There could be those options. My problem is we don't ever encourage somebody to violate copyright. Listing agents, buyer's agents, you're not violating. Buyer never gets it. It's not their survey. If it's
Right.
an existing survey, it's not the buyer's survey. It's only used for the contract between what? The title company and lender. It has nothing to do with the buyer having a survey. Not one thing. In our listing agreement, the listing content, it clearly says that the seller, anything the seller has given us, they've had a license from the original individual or company that created them to give them to us free of any copyright infringement. Yeah, right. Nobody reads, period. All right, would you violate the TCPA or do not call, including the do not call list for your office, or utilize a third-party provider that violates these acts?
No.
No.
There's a guy on the warpath and he's coming after you. He's hit your area big time. And so what I'm going to tell you, you better have a whole lot of money because it's already 6 figures with the attorneys. The attorneys are highly specialized in handling these types of things. And if they file one based on what you did to Keller Williams International, it just means y'all are going to all pay the bill. Keller Williams International doesn't. The franchise is going to do it. So be very careful about that. Mitch, where is the office do not call list register?
I believe Agent Services has it, but I know there's not very many, if anyone, on there because it needs to be reported to us when you're told to stop calling.
Absolutely, because even if they don't call the office and say put me on this list, right? They told the agent must notify the brokerage because anything the agent knows, the brokerage knows, that kind of thing. So the issue. Would you ever advertise without the brokerage information with your information?
No.
No, it's called never. Would you advertise that a property is, quote, well maintained or, quote, like new?
That's an opinion.
No, it's not. Oh, you mean the statements, well maintained or like new? It's about
Like
the
new, I
condition.
have a problem with.
Well,
Well
both of them.
maintained.
No, those are condition of the property. We never advertise the condition of the property. We advertise amenities and features of a property. How do
Okay.
you know it's well maintained?
Mm.
You don't.
She haven't done an
You're not
inspection.
gonna rely upon what the seller says.
Okay.
Yeah. Anybody else
Say
have
that
any
all the time.
questions about that? Do they understand what I'm talking about?
Mhm.
Yeah. Condition of property, the minute you quote the condition of the property, you own it. And I don't know about you, but like new,
Mm.
I
I've
don't like
seen
that term.
listing agents that list like new and the property is 8 years old.
So
So,
Marilyn,
uh-huh,
what would be, because we have, I mean, I've gone in and done listings where the property is incredibly impeccable as far as for your naked eye. So what could we say in a presentation to the MLS that says, you know, here's a property that is, I mean, I would have said well-maintained, but you're saying no.
oh no, if you do that, it better be in your listing agreement and the seller. It's gonna be per seller, well-maintained, per seller, pristine property,
Okay.
but it's not gonna be you. It's gonna have come from the seller in writing.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yep.
And I
Marilyn,
do, yes,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, that's fine,
Philip, how are you doing?
just fine.
Miss you.
Oh,
'Cause
thank you.
we all probably do, but we have Mitch. Well, Mitch. It can one say if like what she just mentioned about it impeccably clean, like can one say recently cleaned or recently
Per seller, recently. cleaned.
always per seller. Okay. Okay, always per seller.
You
Thank
know,
you.
I showed a million houses in new construction too. And as realtors, when we walk in a property, do we kind of know that? Yeah, we kind of do, right?
Mhm.
And but if you advertise that, it could be misleading to a consumer unless you validate who told you that, right? That's what I'm trying to get to, is so that you remove it from yourself having made these statements, because again, it could be very misleading.
Another one I see is never flood it.
Oh, we have one right now where the sellers on their disclosure put, it just came in a little bit. I don't know about you,
An
but
inch of water does a lot of damage.
you, oh my word. I tell you, and I'm thinking, really, what? And you know who fixed that for the sellers? The listing agent's husband.
What?
I don't, and the broker was intermediary. Oh, really? This is just like a trifecta. So, you know, only engineers can tell you how you would divert water. Does everybody understand that? Now, landscape designers and landscapers, some of them are architects, they're very knowledgeable, but an engineer is the one who's going to help you determine if the property can divert the water efficiently away from the dwelling.
Marilyn, Shirlene, I have a question. So on the seller's disclosure, when the seller says, you know, they never flooded or had, you know, filed for flood insurance or claim or anything, we still cannot say never flooded? Because it's written, it's per their signature on the seller's disclosure,
Right. It would have to be per seller, never flooded.
per seller. Okay, okay,
What's our favorite words today?
per seller.
seller.
There
Seller.
you go. Y'all are on the ball. Y'all are not asleep today. That is great.
Thank you,
Okay.
Marilyn.
You're welcome.
Marilyn, I have a question. Property that I'm going to be taking under for a listing is having foundation work done to it. So do I need to put that in the listing, the MLS, or is that only in the seller's disclosure?
It's in the seller's disclosure, and you better have all the documents that were provided.
Yeah, we have that, the permits and everything, so.
Yeah.
Okay,
It'll be in the seller's disclosure.
Marilyn,
Uh-huh.
so as we've gone through this last disaster, and as I walked in my neighborhood, and I knew that some people were having small leaks in their roof and tarps were put over their roofs immediately. One of the things that I've been telling people is that they should get that roof, and that even though they're going to have it fixed and repaired, they still need to get a mold inspection or some kind of an inspection to make sure that there is nothing growing. I said that to a few of my neighbors, and then I thought, oh, I wonder if I'm crossing the line there.
Well, that's your personal opinion on something like that.
Okay.
Any kind of water intrusion, folks, you're in Houston. I'm up here in the hill country, and we're as blasted hot as can be, and we were so humid, which is unusual for us. You know how quick mold grows?
Exactly.
It's disastrous. And so we would advise buyers when they are warned about any water penetration that ever happened on the property, isn't that what the buyer would have to further investigate
Mhm.
during their term? Amen. I mean, that's serious on something like that. All
Okay.
right. Would you ever take a listing of a property that was previously terminated without seeing the termination of listing that was signed and agreed to by all parties?
No.
Never. Would you advise a seller they are exempt from a seller's disclosure because they never lived in the property?
No.
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 Would you advise your sellers to complete the seller's disclosure using the free wizard from Seller Shield?
I'm not sure what the free wizard is.
It's a free wizard, Seller Shield. Your sellers just go in, they don't pay any money, and they complete the seller's
That's a
disclosure.
yes. That's a
Well, I do that
yes.
all the time. I have them use Seller Shield to complete the seller's disclosure.
You would always do that.
Okay, that's a yes.
Would you finalize a listing agreement without having the payoff information on the mortgage on a seller's estimated net sheet?
No.
Well, let me tell you, if you've
Happens all
been
the time.
doing that, you're going to stop doing that. Therein lies the issue. A seller could not agree to list the property for list price unless they saw the estimated net sheet and not having any payoff. Now, if the payoff information you get is per the seller, you're going to say on the form, per seller, payoff is 100,000. But bottom line is, you have to make sure that the estimated cost associated with the seller listing the property for the list price, the sellers would have to sign off on that and say, yeah, it's done.
One of my listings recently, Marilyn, the seller did not necessarily tell me what the payoff was. What he said was, it's around about this price. And I said, well, I will put that in there, and then it's up to you to make sure you're making the money you need to make.
Yeah, if it's per seller and they gave you the number, you're not responsible for it.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get.
Yeah, I didn't get it from the lender. I didn't
Yeah.
get them to give me a lender statement. I just took their word and put it in the net sheet as this is what they've told me.
Here's what I'm going to tell you. Now, years ago when I took a listing, and I've been licensed since 1993, we always had the request for mortgage information for an owner of a property who was going to list their property and have a mortgage on it. We had all the information. We had their account number and everything. Just this past month, there have been 3 instances where the listing agent didn't have any of that information and the sellers did not give it to the title company when requested, nor timely. Something was up right there. That was a telltale sign something was going on.
Right.
Yeah, and so we still have that form. One of the brokers is considering making sure that you don't get to list the property unless you have that, because it was so embarrassing for the seller to become non-responsive. We represented the seller, and the title company could not get the payoff information. And there was a reason for that. The seller had lied.
Gosh.
Yeah, it's real unfortunate. And the reason I'm telling you these things is because, as I said, we have got to cross the T's and dot the I's. Period. all the time, every transaction. Number 9, would you ever finalize a listing without the statutorily required disclosures for a MUD, a water control improvement district, a levee improvement district, a public improvement district, the seller's disclosure?
No,
Absolutely not. The statutorily required notices says that they have to be provided and all executed by all parties prior to the execution of any contract. The ones that are mentioned in 6E3, the statutorily required ones, then in 11, it shows what they are, and they notate certain things. They're going to change a little bit of that up in the proposed changes to the contract. And in particular, advising the buyer that if the seller fails to do that, you get a free walk, buyer. So it's very important that you do that. And even though TREC had to come out and create their own statutorily required notice for those districts that do not comply with the law and put it on their websites, TREC said, don't use ours if there is a notice by the district on the website. Yeah, because nobody on earth that'll be able to complete it. All right, would you finalize a listing for farm and ranch property, unimproved property, new construction complete and incomplete without having your sellers complete the disclosure questions?
no.
No, and here we go. Okay, I created this because when TREC decided to make all the changes, it was kind of backwards, right?
Right.
Buyers put an offer, and yet there are all these 8 questions in these TREC contract forms about the property. A buyer's not going to be able to complete it. So I created it so listing agents don't have it from the sellers except in writing per the sellers. Everybody understand that? Now here's the interesting part of this. We have buyers who submit an offer without having the seller's responses. Well, unfortunately, I've seen where it's on their initial offer, it was blank. And then the sellers completed it and initialed it, but the buyer never did. What do you think happens then? That buyer agent's going to be in trouble. Nobody makes a change over your buyer's initials or signatures without them having approved those changes with their initials in the day. Period. So I did this because, and again, when TREC met in April, the broker lawyer committee, they said this was brought up as being a little backwards, right? Just like they said originally. And TREC's broker lawyer committee says, we're not going to change it. Okay, so you're just going to have to change your best business practices based on something like that. And again, you want it per the seller. You don't want them to tell you something and it not have been in writing from them. Okay, just to make sure. Would you ever have any questions? Okay. Would you ever finalize a listing on vacant, unimproved property without the seller providing you in writing all utilities that are available or on the property?
No.
Absolutely right. You would never do that. And the reason is we're having issues right now with what utilities were on the property, what the listing agent said was on the property, and what the seller told the listing agent, but we don't have that in writing, all these types of things. So I'm going to show you something in the unimproved property contract. In paragraph 7A, there is a notice. And this is what I'm going to tell you, buyer's agents. It says, buyer should determine the availability of utilities to the property suitable to satisfy buyer's needs. That is done by the buyer. No buyer's agent is going to say the listing agent said this. Oh, no, it doesn't matter what the listing agent says or the seller. The buyer must determine this. So you better make sure this is one provision you have in writing and that the buyer understands they absolutely are going to be on the hook for making the ultimate decision. Any questions on that? Okay. As
Marilyn,
a
I'm
listing
sorry.
agent would
I
you-
don't see that. Could you look back at the,
on 7A,
all right,
It's-
7A? Okay,
A, notice, buyer should
says-
determine the availability of utilities to the property suitable to satisfy buyer's needs.
okay. All right, great. Thank you, thank you.
Yeah, and so what you say to your buyers in writing, look, on this MLS, this marketing material, they say there are these things. Well, you cannot take their word. You must independently verify the availability. And by chance, when would you do that? That'll be another question. Okay. Would you ever, as a listing agent, ever have your seller complete a contract addendum prior to a buyer's offer? For example, the addendum for property subject to mandatory property owners association.
No,
Thank you. You could never have done that. Now, are you Trek violation? You're completing a form when it's not required. And I don't know, the last time I checked, who presents offers on properties? Buyers, not sellers. And here's what we had. We had an issue where, well, in compliance, the addendum for property subject to mandatory membership had a date in January, and yet the buyer signed it and the contract was executed in April. Somebody take themselves off of mute and tell me what's wrong with that.
can you restate that?
In the contract documents, there was the addendum for property subject to a mandatory property owners association. The sellers signed it in January. The buyers signed it in April, and the contract was executed in April.
Marilyn, sometimes I do that to get, to get them aware that I'm going to ask for this information later. But now that you say that, I thought sometimes it was part of the listing part, not the contract.
Never,
I thought I got zapped one time, but maybe not.
no,
But,
never.
I'll just save it then.
No, you're not
can
gonna
send
save
that
it.
around? You're
Your
saying the
buyer-
buyer's agent.
A buyer has the notice, they have all the association information. It's in section 8 of the seller's disclosure. So when the buyer
Oh,
presents
I
the
see.
offer, then the seller can reject it, modify it.
Marilyn, I would think
Got it.
that the information with the HOA could change in that time period, right? January through April. So it may have been valid at the time of signatures by the seller, but it could have changed. No, that's not the reason.
No,
Oh,
sir.
okay.
Nope. Because
and I
it's
don't-
not about, the addendum doesn't have anything about information about the association. It's just an addendum, so that the parties can, who's going to pay for it, who's going to deliver it, title company requires it. My problem is, it is a contract addenda. It is not a listing addendum. And your sellers just need to be able to respond to the offer that they've received, not take away the benefit of the bargain. That's what I'm trying to get to. Any agent and seller that say, I'm taking away the benefit of the bargain, the buyer has already got lots against them. They were not getting the benefit of the bargain. That's what negotiation and an offer is all about, that the parties have the benefit of the bargain. And you don't want a buyer to not have the benefit of the bargain, ever. Sellers can, you know, counter or send an invitation. That's fine. That's from the seller. Then the buyer has a decision, right? But at least the buyer is not being told prior to making an offer, this is what you have to agree to.
Well, and Marilyn, though, so you're saying even if we have when we have a contract signed, then the buyer's agent sends that to us. Is it a proper contract if that is not signed? The HOA information?
No, the buyer agent helps the buyer present the offer with the addendum on the offer.
Yeah, okay, because what I found one time long ago, and it was long ago, was that the buyer's agent is like, oh, we need to get this, and then she checks the box, oh, we don't want the documents. Well, my seller wants the documents because my seller wants to make sure it's clear. So, you know, I guess I'm wrong, but a lot of time I'm doing that investigation to find out how much the transfer fee is and how much
As a
the cost
listing
of the
agent,
docs are.
you have to do that upfront because it's on your estimated net sheet.
Yeah, okay.
You've already done that. This is an addendum for the contract, and it's clear in paragraph D. Title won't close unless they are getting the documents that they need to close.
Mm. And what about that? I mean, I'm just a stickler, but many times the buyer will send me that they don't want the HOA docs. And I just say, no, you're going to pay the transfer. And, you know, my
The
seller.
buyer and seller negotiate all of that on the addendum.
Mhm.
Paragraph D clearly says, hey, if you guys are marked anything in A like A4, now I need to know who's going to pay for it, deliver it, and give it to us so that we can close the transaction.
And so then they fill out the form. They agree to that during the contract presentation from the buyer.
The buyer has it on their offer. Otherwise, the buyer agent doesn't know what they're doing.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the buyer's agent's job. If you get an offer as a listing agent and they don't have it, you just send back an invitation and say, resubmit the offer with using the addendum. You know,
Okay,
those are the
okay.
things we have to kind of point out when we're on the listing side and the buyer agent doesn't know what they're doing. Because
Okay.
it's real clear. It's in section 8 of the seller's disclosure. Some sellers don't complete it. I hope it's not our sellers. We always want our sellers to complete it. Would you ever place a notation in MLS that there's a right of first refusal when there is not one on the property? Can somebody tell me what right of first refusal means and where it's found in our contract forms?
I don't know who it is. I'm sorry. I should.
No, Karen, you've answered plenty for the agents that are all on the call.
Mhm.
It's in our condominium contract, folks. Paragraph 2.
That's right.
Yep. And some of these, you have to know this as a buyer's agent because that provision in paragraph 2 of the condominium contract clearly says that there is a right of first refusal on this property. Your buyer has to understand that while the contract may be executed, it's in suspension until it has been exercised. And then the buyers and sellers will have an amended effective date if it is not going to be exercised by the association. Now, we have issues with this because there are older developments that have these restrictions and covenants. Okay, so personally, I find them highly discriminatory, period. You're never going to change my mind on it. It just has that feeling when an organization, it just does to me. So that's why you don't see it on a lot of new ones, but the previous restrictions that do have it, listing agents have to be very careful about it because they have to know the exact processes that the seller has to adhere to And the buyer agent absolutely needs to know that for their buyer needs to understand that.
And what did you say there in the end? I'm listening to you, that I need to wait for that notification and then have an amended effective date?
Yeah, once, in that paragraph 2 of the condominium contract, it clearly states that if the right of first refusal, that the approval, that it's either been exercised or someone in the association is going to counter and act on it, there's an amended effective date, because the buyer is not going to do anything until that passes. So once there's amended effective date, then all the dates in the contract and addendum go forward from the amended effective date. Okay. Would you ever place a notation in MLS agent remarks when the sellers are subject to FERPA?
Yes, you would.
Amen. Thank you. And the reason you would have to do that is every prospective buyer needs to know that prior to going under offer. You don't hide that from them. And you have already vetted all of that as a listing agent. So you know that because that could be on your seller's estimated net sheet on something like that. Okay. Would you ever advise the sellers and show them the provision in paragraph 19 of the contract regarding representations?
What is that?
Yes, you would, absolutely. And I'll tell you why, because I'm going to read this to you, and I've talked
Got it.
about this, but this is the fodder that parties that are going to sue the sellers for something. It says, all covenants, representations, and warranties in this contract survive closing. If any representation of seller in this contract is untrue on the closing date, seller will be in default. It doesn't say may be in default, they say will be in default. So sellers are going to think long and hard. They're not going to complete any required disclosures. Everything the seller tells you is going to be written down by you per seller. You're not going down for repeating what they told you. This is the seller's representations. So it's interesting. Even the paragraphs in our contracts that don't have boxes to mark or initials or anything are so important to the transaction. So we just need to make sure we understand which ones the seller better be paying attention to. Okay, so a couple of questions on general contracts. Would you ever advise a seller that it is better to always send an invitation than negotiating with a party that has submitted an offer?
Yes, I would do that.
Yes.
Very good. And here's what I'm going to tell you happened. About a week or so ago, I got an agent who called me and they were talking about a buyer that had called them regarding their listing. They showed the buyer the property multiple times. It was in a high rise and they took them to the association office, all these different things, the management office and that. Then up pops an offer. And the offer is from a buyer's agent / attorney. And I told the listing agent, I said, you're going to use the seller's invitation. You're going to only have it coming from the sellers. You're not going to get caught in misinterpretation, saying something, communicating something in writing that is not coming from the seller directly on that. She said she had to use the invitation several more times that weekend. And she asked, and she told me, she said, Marilyn, this buyer agent, I've shown this buyer 3 times. This buyer agent has never shown the property. I said, well, ask him. And he lied. He said he had shown it. She knows. It had to be her access to approve all showings. So I said, well, now it's been revealed that they don't disclose truthfully. So your sellers are going to be very guarded. Well, guess what happened? They were negotiating only with sellers' invitation. So it was not a counter. They were just, the seller sent, I would prefer this. Next thing you know, the offer would be revised and back in the listing agent. Listing agent would go through it with the seller. Sellers would say, no, this is not what I want. Send another seller's invitation. When the final element of their negotiation was based upon what the seller had sent in an invitation, the listing agent thought everything was fine until they went through and found that the buyer agent had changed a provision and special provisions that affected a $22,000 assessment. Originally, the buyer said they would pay it, and then the buyer agent switched out the word buyers on the last copy and put sellers.
It is so nasty.
I agree. And that's part of why I cautioned her to, once we knew he had not told the truth. When an agent lies to you, there's no coming back from that, folks. I don't care what you say. Your seller needs to know that. They don't want a buyer that's represented by somebody who doesn't tell the truth. Just saying.
That's right.
Wow.
Would any of you as listing agents want a buyer agent that doesn't tell the truth? on the
No,
transaction?
no.
No. We are our word, folks. I've talked about this a lot with the Code of Ethics.
You have that one time where, I mean, I know it takes time to sit down and go over the contract word by word, blank by blank again, but I had one switch and forever.
I know it changes you. I mean, again, fortunately, just like you said, you have to go through it with a fine-tooth comb, no matter what. You're never going to take the word of somebody else. You're going to look at what the parties agreed to in writing, right? Yeah. So just saying, be very careful about that. Would you ever advise a buyer that no matter what is conveyed by the listing agent, there is no contract between the parties until all parties agree in writing?
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah, you would always do that.
Yes.
Always. And again, there are some agents that kind of let their guard down because the other side seems so great, right? No, folks. Remember your fiduciary duty and who you have the fiduciary duty to. Would you ever advise your client that the contract is not about square footage in writing?
Yes.
You would always advise your buyers that this contract is not about square footage. And you would put it in writing prior to them submitting the offer.
I'm missing something on that. What do you mean?
Okay, the contract's not about square footage, but we have dozens and dozens and dozens of buyers who get all upset. The property met value, but it came back at a different square footage. And they now think that they have to renegotiate with the seller.
Got it.
Yeah, our contracts are about value, folks. Square footage is
Even
another.
measurements,
Even what?
measurements of the rooms and that, it's not about square footage, and they are to verify the buyer
Yeah.
is to verify.
Right.
Yeah, I love these. I have read remarks, agent remarks, and the listing agent says buyer agent and buyer to verify. As a buyer's agent, I'm not verifying any room dimensions, folks.
No,
No, it is the
buyers
buyer,
need to.
right? You know,
I advise that. Yeah.
I was one of the first agents in San Antonio that had one of those digital ones where you can shoot a laser across the room and find out the real dimensions and stuff like that. Came in handy listing properties. Would you ever advise a buyer the amounts needed and the time limits in writing for earnest money and option fee?
Yes.
Yeah, buyer's agents, they would always do that. Absolutely. And I'm going to tell you what's happened. It's really unfortunate. The buyer agent does this because the buyers have to what? They have to deposit the earnest money and option fee per the terms of the contract. And we've had several where the buyer agent didn't put it in writing, the buyer sent the wrong amount, and per paragraph 5 of the contract, title company is going to do what? They're going to apply the
Option fee
first amounts
first.
to the option fee that exists, and then the remainder to the earnest money. And the seller terminated the contract because the earnest money was not deposited per the terms of the contract. And it all came back on the buyer agent. Really very unfortunate. Now, if you have it in writing to the buyer and they still do something that's not right, that's all on them, right? But you better make sure that you have that covered so that they're very aware of what they need to do. Would you ever advise your buyer that they do not need a survey?
No.
No.
No, never.
Mhm.
Never. There's the word. See, would you ever or never do this? So never. Okay. Would you ever advise the buyer that they do not need an inspection?
No.
No, never.
Never. There you go. Would you ever advise a buyer purchasing vacant land that they do not need a termination option period?
No.
No.
Never. And I showed you that provision in 7A. We're using it as a dagger against a buyer who signed the contract and clearly knew that. On something.
Marilyn?
Yes.
I do have a question on the inspector. So I had a property recently that just got inspected and they posted the inspection as one of the documents for the property. Can I advise them to use that in lieu of their own inspection or
Absolutely never.
never?
Never. You would tell them, I would never advise you to do this. This is an inspection for a previous buyer at a certain point in time. Then the buyer gets to make their decision, but you'll never advise them to do that.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
I'll
Good to
tell you
know.
what happened. We were in a lawsuit. We represented the buyer. And when I got, of course, the documents came about the lawsuit, and I gathered all the documents and I looked at it on the inspection report. And the buyer's complaining about the heating and air conditioning. And the buyer agent admitted that they thought it would be okay to use that inspection report because it was a good inspector. The buyer's agent was familiar with him. Yeah,
Mhm.
well, at the time they did the inspection, there was no heating and air conditioning installed.
What?
Yep. It was
Oh
a
my God.
rehab,
My.
and the rehabber had not installed it yet. The first buyer came and did the inspection, and it clearly stated on that inspection report that they were not installed yet. Why would a buyer use that? And we paid dearly for that. It was a horrible situation. So, no, we would never advise the buyer not to do that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Would you ever advise a buyer and seller in writing of the dates and provisions in the contract for compliance?
Yes.
Yes.
Definitely.
Always, yeah. Would you ever advise a buyer and their lender regarding strict performance under the third-party financing?
Yes.
agreement?
Yes.
Definitely.
Yep. Would you ever advise your client what time is of the essence means for those provisions in the third-party financing?
Yes.
Yes.
Somebody take themselves off mute and tell me what time is of the essence means in that respect.
Time is of the essence means that the time is critically important, and if not followed, it could mean the contract.
Yeah, time is of the essence means if you don't do it within this time element, like number of days and third party, right? If you don't do it within those number of days, you don't have the provision. And buyers usually get burned by that. And who do buyers blame? They blame the buyer's agent. Okay. Would you ever advise a client properly regarding the provisions a buyer has for termination of a contract?
Absolutely, yes, always.
And I'll tell you, the notice of buyer's termination of contract has several paragraphs where they can mark, because they're the most common uses that a buyer would have for a provision to terminate and give proper notice. Then there's one that has a fill in the blank type of thing, right? Would you ever advise a buyer to terminate a contract without a provision in the contract to terminate?
No.
No.
Never. And that form is perfect because that last fill in the blank, it says you have to point to a contract provision, paragraph number, or the addendum, right? And so here's what I see. Buyer lost their job. Buyer changed their mind. I don't know what buyer agent could stand up, raise their right hand and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth on the stand. And then the plaintiff attorney for the buyer says, please point to that provision that gave the buyer the right to give notice and terminate. It's not there, folks. That's why I made light of it a little bit. But bottom line is, we've had so many sellers have to call out the buyer agent and their broker for not advising the buyer properly and using a form when a buyer didn't have a provision to terminate. You can't use that form if a buyer is breaching the contract.
Right.
So you have to know the difference. And I've done a session on this between breach and termination. They're very different in real estate. And a lot of agents sometimes use them interchangeably. So that's what causes some of the confusion. Okay, would you advise your clients about non-realty items?
Yes.
You talk to your sellers at time of listing, and then you talk to your buyers before they make an offer. This non-realty items is what is so important for buyers that are considering making an offer. The buyer's agent shares with the buyers, oh, they put it in agent remarks that the seller will convey refrigerator, washer, dryer, wine cooler, right? And then the buyer agent fails to put a non-realty item addendum on the offer. Who's responsible?
The buyer's agent.
Buyer's agent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't want y'all to be a nonprofit. I want you to be a profit center. So please don't do that. Would you ever advise the buyers or seller that they cannot negotiate terms of the contract after the termination option has ended?
No.
Never. Right. Would you ever have an IABS, a buyer tenant agreement, and draft an offer in less than 30 minutes?
No.
No.
It would be difficult.
Well,
If
tell
you're
me
doing it
how
properly.
it could be done.
Yeah.
I saw one last week. It's less than a minute. So I called up the agent. I said, okay, so you got the information about brokerage services signed, a buyer tenant agreement. In the 30 seconds, did you show the property before your buyer put an offer in?
Mhm.
What's wrong with that picture, folks?
The IABS has to be done first, and the buyer tenant representation agreement must be signed before you show the property.
It's the law, the IABS.
Mhm.
It's a law. It's not a trick rule. It's a law. And with this new change that's coming about, you better have your T's crossed and your I's dotted. This is what I'm trying to tell you. And again, when I saw it in less than a minute, I thought, how on earth can you do that? Even 30 minutes. You can't do that.
Marilyn,
Yes.
my older clients like to discuss the offer with a PDF in hand. And then once we've discussed the PDF, we'll do the dot loop together with me standing over their shoulder and remind them, okay, this is the paragraph we discussed earlier. This is the paragraph we discussed earlier. So if you've discussed it with them in hand, when they're signing it digitally, sometimes it happens really fast.
Well, the IABS and the buyer tenant agreement are absolutely going to be done before you show the property.
Absolutely, at your first buyer's meeting.
And that's not what I'm saying. If that offer was drafted way past days, a day later, 6 hours after you showed the property, that might be okay, but that's not what I'm seeing in compliance. So it needs to stop now. You need to do a much better job.
So recently I had a situation where somebody contacted me and I met them. I'd never met them before, and I went took him to lunch and had the IABS with me and the buyer's tenant representation agreement with me. And I also had a list of homes that in a neighborhood that I thought he would be interested in. He wanted to go see, we went over everything and he wanted to go see it immediately. I had him initial the IABS as soon as I had given it to him and talked with him about it. And then I handwrote I had it as a draft and I crossed out draft and I handwrote the buyer representation agreement and had him sign that and dated it. And I think I may have put the timing on that. Then I showed the property and I uploaded all of that to the dot loop. And then the next day when we were going to go forward, I went and did it a cleaner copy, but I had both in there.
Yeah, we don't care about the cleaner copy unless it's not legible, but it really needs to be dated at the right time. That's what the big
Right.
thing is on something like that. Okay. Would you ever draft a contract offer without a legal description?
When I make a mistake.
No.
No.
Here's what I'm going to tell you is very tricky for you. There is a listing and the seller says, I have a land parcel of 50 acres and I'm willing to sell you 10. Just make sure you're not the one who comes up with whatever is going to be put in there to describe what the buyer says that they're buying and what the seller says they're selling. I had too many of them that had the entire parcel as the legal description, and then some other gobbledygook that the agents put in special provisions. And title company said, no, the seller's selling all of it. You can't have things like that, folks. Be very careful. I'm seeing way too much of that lately on something like that. And
Good
that's where the
question.
agents get into trouble.
So question, let's say in that situation, it's multiple owners and they didn't do a partition, but they are trying to exclude a piece of that property. Wouldn't they have to have a survey?
Well, they will per the contract. They'll have to have a survey typically. They can, in that provision, they can buy it or the seller can. The problem is the legal description that they probably have is for the entire parcel. Therein lies the issue. And your clients are either going to have an attorney that's going to draft the language, and this usually comes from the listing side. Smart listing agents do this. Their attorney for the seller is giving them the language so that they could, in fact, delineate what part of this big parcel the buyer was purchasing on the contract form.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm seeing way too much of this, and then we get into issues about who drafted it. We don't draft legal language. I'm just going to tell you, and it's confusion. And agents wanted to put in, well, it's contingent upon the buyer agreeing to. The buyer's going to get a survey, and if they're not acceptable with the survey, they're going to negotiate with the seller. The farm and ranch contract has an actual provision for that if it's not exactly what the parties had agreed to for the sales price regarding the acreage and that. They're thinking about adding that to the unimproved property contract, but just be very, very careful about that. Okay, the last big question is, would you ever submit a listing and a contract at the same time in command?
No.
No, you should submit the listing within 3 days of it going on the MLS, right?
Yes.
If you're smart, you will. And the reason I say that is if you didn't get everything you need for the listing done well, right, and you get it returned to you, now you're going back to your seller. And at a time when there's already an executed contract, it just causes you way too much issue. Do these things in the right order, and it'll be much, much better, really. And that's what your goal is to make sure that you know what you're doing, that you've completed all the forms properly from standpoint from a listing, but yeah.
Marilyn,
Uh-huh.
I would like to go back to number 30. Mitch and I had a discussion over this. I have a client, and I sent her the IABS and the buyer tenant representation agreement. Sent it like a couple of days before. Mitch will know exactly what I'm talking about. And then we went out, so it's in Dotloop that I sent it to the buyer. Then we went out that Saturday. Let's just say it was sent that Wednesday. And I went over everything because she likes to read everything. Went over everything, but she didn't sign it. So we went out that Saturday and looked at homes. Then she decided to get a new bill. And I spent 6 hours with the buyer, and she signed a contract to have a house built. However, my buyer rep agreement and IABS were not signed prior to her signing the contract. So I explained to Mitch that, hey, you see, I sent it to her in Dotloop, but it still was a problem. So our conclusion to this was to have it printed out and take it with me and have her sign it before she signs a contract with a builder or whomever. It was a builder, new builder. So is there any way around that? My point to Mitch was that it's in Dotloop. You see, I sent it to her, but I got a red flag on it.
Well, the
She
IABS,
was slow to sign
the
everything.
IABS, you can prove you delivered it.
Both of them were delivered to her.
No,
Oh.
you're jumping the gun here, Shirlene.
Okay,
You can prove delivery of the information about brokerage services at the right time. You can prove that. Okay, why you wouldn't get them to initial and date it so that it could prove, because now you have to have proof that you did it. That proof has to be uploaded in command for the broker's record. Okay. The buyer tenant agreement, you don't have one until both of you sign.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know she was gonna do a contract that day. And I kept asking, you haven't signed my buyer tenant rep agreement. And she said, oh, I'm gonna sign it. It was not like I was gonna have a problem with her signing, but she just took her time. So I understand what you're saying. It's got
Yeah.
to be signed.
And,
Okay.
and as of August 17th, you'll be in serious trouble. You
I'm
won't
glad
be able
this
to
was
show a
before
property.
17. Okay.
You won't be able to give them a list of properties.
You
Not
can't
without
even give them a
cover.
list of properties?
Nope. That's working with a buyer. That has to have a buyer signed buyer tenant agreement. Bob Hill wrote all of that in case you want to go back to your email.
I
They
should go back
define
and read
what's
that.
working with a buyer and not working with a buyer.
Okay.
So we've got a lot of issues. Now, intermediary. Would you ever conduct a transaction where the broker becomes an intermediary? Yes.
Yes.
Would you ever not have a fully signed intermediary relationship notice prior to any submission of a buyer's offer or tenant's application?
No.
Correct, Justin. You're shaking your head right. Would you ever
I would
improperly
always in
use
the-
intermediary if the buyer is a customer? There is no intermediary when the buyer is a customer. They have no one to represent them. Okay. And here's two big bonus questions. Would you ever complete a TREC or TXR form without knowledge of the proper completion of the form? Never. Would you ever submit a form to another party without it being completed?
No.
Never. Okay, now I'm going to tell you something. They think that we're not very important in the transaction. You know, those plaintiffs' attorneys tried to do that with that verdict that they got on Halloween last year. How many of you think that a buyer and seller could have answered those questions that I just asked you to answer?
None of them.
None of them.
None of them.
There you go, folks. I'm
No.
telling you. And what I'm going to do next month is visit with you about your value proposition. You know, everybody's done Valued Square and some great training. I'm going to kind of give you a hint about, for those of you who are new maybe to the business, how you go about evaluating what your worth is. Now, personally, just passing the test is a big worth in my book, because it was a test to trick you, not a test to adjust your knowledge of anything. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit more about what are the factors that kind of go into how you give what your value in the transaction is. And there are a lot of things that are, certain things, experience and knowledge and all these other things. But more importantly, when I worked for the world's largest insurance broker in the risk management division, every day at the end of the day, somebody came and picked up a piece of paper that was taken from a tablet for my fee billing. And then it was processed because the clients were charged based on what I did for them and every 15 minutes. And so my boss would look at it, and if I hadn't filled it in that day with a lot of good, valid information, they're going to look at me and like, why are you sitting here? You're of no value to us because you did nothing of value for the clients that we represent. And so, I'm not going to give you a fee billing tablet, but I'm going to have components that you're going to kind of consider what would it be. And what's interesting, when I first joined real estate, I did it because my brother was a broker and he was going to open a RE/MAX franchise very close to where I live at the time in Fair Oaks Ranch up in outside of San Antonio. And I'm a software application designer in one of my lives. And so my brother said, you know what? None of these realtors know how to use the computer. I want you to go out there and design the system so that all they have to do is do what they're great at, is get leads, produce, and then we have it automated for them to be able to keep track of everything, their clients, and all this kind of stuff. So I designed it, I got my license, and then he decided, and his partner decided to go back to Houston and not open that RE/MAX franchise.
Wow.
And so why I'm telling you this is because I did a time limits for everybody in the office, and I asked them to contribute to our tree pack. And I would give them my template for time limits, just like I give it to y'all, right? And I did that because I was a chairman of the TARPAC. And I knew that realtors, if they don't get fed, they don't give money if they can't deduct it. I knew this, I'm not stupid. So I had to give them something of value, right? So that they would contribute to our PAC, because our PACs are incredible. I have people who donate to our PACs that aren't even in our industry, but it's the only one that helps all property owners. There's a lot of good things, and our association through Texas Realtors has been instrumental, every legislature, to do those great things for all property owners. So that's something you should be very proud of. If you don't know about it, you want to make sure that you familiarize yourself when they send out all those updates regarding what they've done and what they haven't done. My thing is, you have value. We just have to, for those that are new, you're going to be struggling because a lot of us are very experienced. Just by having experience, there is value there. But you're going to have a composite of various things that are really going to help you understand some of the components that go into these value propositions that we give our clients. And I just proved to you, you don't think buyer's agents aren't going to be important? Tenants agents? You think landlords could write a lease that would comply with the law? I don't think so. And half of us haven't read the 17 pages of the lease anyway. That would be the first fundamental that we would want to make sure. But it's an incredible lease and it complies with the law. So we have tons of value to provide to our clients. We just need to make sure it's fine-tuned and that it's in writing, and that you quit being silent about all the things you do. Truthfully, they think what we do is easy because you're not burdening them with every 15-minute increments what you did that day for them. And that's our fault. We're going to do a much better job of this because those plaintiffs' attorneys that got that verdict and all these other plaintiffs' attorneys are trying to say we are not valuable or essential in the transaction. And I know they're dead wrong. Do you remember COVID? If some of you have joined after COVID, somebody tell me what Governor Abbott thought of realtors during COVID.
We were essential.
Dang straight,
Essential
we were
workers.
essential.
Mhm.
To me, that's the best value proposition. And I know a bunch of you got COVID too, because you were exposed to a lot of things. On something like, we lost so many sweet agents to COVID during that time. It was really heartbreaking. But we are essential. We just have to do a better job of, as my husband used to say, tooting our horn, right? Or patting ourselves on the back, right? If y'all, some of you are too young to know that, but you know, when you pat yourself on the back, a lot of people think, you know, you're bragging about yourself, right? Well, I think we're going to have to do a little bit, and you can temper it. You don't have to sound like you know everything, right? But there is much value that you provide to our clients each and every day. And we just need to do a much better job of conveying that in writing. That's the critical thing. All right, good people. Wasn't this fun?
It was good deal.
Yes. sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Everybody have a very safe and wonderful Memorial Day weekend. I hope all of you have electricity so that
Yes.
we have AC going pretty good. So everybody,
No.
please take care.
I wouldn't be on this call with you, Marilyn, if I didn't.
Oh, you're so sweet.
I am. I wouldn't miss it for the world, even hot as I am. No power.
Thanks, Marilyn.
All right, honey, y'all take care.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.